Near where I now live, there once was a farmer. He and his wife were getting old. It was hard for them to do the heavy work, and so they decided that they would take on a lad to work for them. They went down into town on market day. They went to the place where people would stand if they were looking for a situation. And there was a lad named Owen, whose family they knew. And so they fetched him back to the farm. Anything they asked him to do, he would do immediately. They never had to raise their voice to him. So when the snow began to fall, it was Owen who said he would go and see if the sheep had food and shelter. He put on his hat and his scarf and his gloves and his boots and his coat, and off he went. The farmer and his wife sat by the fire waiting for him to return. Night came. They sat by the fire and waited until the morning. And then anxiously they put on their boots and their scarves and their gloves and their coats and their hats, and they went out to find him. And I'm sorry to tell you, as they trudged through the forest behind their farm, they found a lump in the snow. And when they brushed off the snow, they found beneath it Owen's corpse. He had got lost in the woods during the night, and rather than stagger around, he'd lain down and fallen into a sleep from which he would never wake. They were heartbroken. It was as though they'd lost a son. As soon as they could, they took his body down to the town and they buried it in the graveyard. And the night after the burial, the farmer's wife woke up her husband. She said, "Listen." And as they listened, they could hear a screeching, a scratching, a scraping. They lay in bed, cold with fear, until the morning came. Then they went into the kitchen. They opened the front door, and the door swung open to reveal a yard that had been cleared of snow. They had been listening to the sound of a shovel scraping against the cobblestones of the yard. Who had done this? During the next night, they heard hammering. Next morning they got up. They walked across the farmyard to the barn. Now the barn had always had holes in its roof, holes that they'd never had the time or the money to fix. But now, all of those holes had been mended. Each night they lay awake to the sound of someone or something working on their behalf. As soon as they could, they went back down into the town. They went to the house of the cunning man, the man who knew the answers to every question, the oldest man in the town. They explained what was happening, and the cunning man grinned a toothless grin and said, "It's the Bwca." "Bwca," they said. "What's a Bwca?" "You know those woods behind your farm? The Bwca is the spirit of those woods. The Bwca was old when God was a little boy. He's always been there." "What does he look like?" said the farmer's wife. "Sharp ears, a snout of a nose. He looks a little like a child, and a little like an old man, hunched, hairy, shambling. The Bwca has taken pity on you because you lost Owen. He's doing the work that Owen used to do." Bwcas. If they like you, they will help you. But if they don't, they will make your life a misery. The farmer's wife thought to herself, if this Bwca is helping us, we ought to reward him in some way. And so that night, she stepped out of the farmhouse, into the farmyard, the wind blowing around her skirts. She walked across the yard to the barn. She put down a bowl of cream in the shadows and whispered, "Bwca, if you can hear me, this is for you, to thank you for all the work you've done on our behalf. She heard a shuffling in the shadows, and she turned and she fled across the farmyard into the kitchen. She shut the kitchen door, she ran across to the fire, she sat by the fire, and even though she sat next to those flames, she shuddered. Next morning they got up. The Bwca had built a fence around the farmyard, a fence they'd never had the money or the time to build. When they went into the barn, there was the bowl, and it had been licked clean. It was that way from then on. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. They always put the bowl out for the Bwca, and every night they would be lulled to sleep by the sound of him digging or ploughing or hammering. They were rich. For the first time in their lives, when they walked, their pockets jangled. They thought to themselves, we could take on a maid to cook for us, to work around the house. So they went down into town on market day. They went to the place where people would stand if they were needing a situation. And there was a young woman. They fetched her back. The first job they gave her to do was to put the bowl of cream in the barn for the Bwca. She stepped out of the kitchen. The front door slammed shut behind her. She looked at the bowl. She looked around herself, and she thought, Bwca? There's no such thing. She kept the cream, and in its place she put a bowl of water from a puddle. She placed it into the shadows in the barn and said, Bwca, that's for you. That night, the farmer's wife woke up her husband. He said, why did you wake me? I can't hear anything. And she said, that's what I mean. That's why I woke you. Where's the Bwca? The Bwca ought to be out there working. We ought to be able to hear him. Where is he? So they got up. They lit a rushlight. They went over to where the maid was sleeping. They shook her shoulders. They said, did you put that bowl of cream out like we told you to for the Bwca? She looked up at the two of them, the shadows shifting across their faces. And she wanted to keep her job. And so she lied. She said, of course. And she rolled over and she pressed her face into the pillow. Next morning, when they searched the farm and the farmyard and the fields, there was no sign of the Bwca. When they went into the barn, though, there was the bowl, smashed into shards. For a week, there was no sign of the Bwca. But then he returned, and just as the cunning man had said, if he liked you, he would help you. But if the Bwca didn't like you, he would make your life a misery. Whatever they did in the daytime, he ruined at night. If they dug a hole, he would fill it in. If they ploughed a field, he'd make the grass and brambles grow up overnight. If they built a wall, he'd tear it apart. Any farmhands they hired would be frightened away. They sent for the minister. He came into the kitchen. He put a stool in front of the fire. He knelt, he put his elbows on the stool, and he began to whisper prayers to banish the Bwca. All invisible, the Bwca grabbed one of the legs of the stool and yanked. The poor minister's face hit the floor, blood poured from his nostrils. Invisible, the Bwca kicked and punched the minister. The minister ran from the farmhouse, jumped onto the back of his horse, and bolted out of the farmyard, never to be seen there again. The farmer turned to his wife. He said, I can't stand it here any longer. We'll move on. Leave him behind. Start again somewhere else. And so they piled a few things onto the back of a wagon. A cauldron that they used for boiling water, sheets and blankets, a few tools. And they climbed onto the wagon, shook the reins of the horse, and off they went, leaving the farmhouse behind. As they made their way down the hill, one of the neighbours saw them approaching. He stood with his back to the hedge as they passed by. He saw the things piled up on the back of the wagon and said, You're leaving? Aye, said the farmer. We can't stand this place any longer. We're going to start again somewhere else. Goodbye. Goodbye, said the neighbour. Goodbye, said the farmer's wife. Goodbye, said the neighbour. Goodbye, said the maid. Goodbye, said the neighbour. Once the wagon had gone past, the neighbour looked at the back of it, the cauldron, and out of the cauldron popped a little hairy head and a little hairy paw, and it waved and said, "Goodbye."